Hello, guys. Welcome back to the Pokepreet Podcast. Today, we're joined by the special guest, Vinay Lal. I absolutely love his historical videos. He's a professor at UCLA. Henry's going to be mostly doing this podcast interview since I'm going to have to leave in about 40 minutes. But so good to have you on, Professor Lal. Could you just introduce yourself super quick?
Yes, well, I'm a professor of history and Asian American studies at UCLA, and in fact, I'm completing 32 years in the same department and at the same university. And just to give a slightly more elaborate glimpse into my background, but my doctorate is in South Asian languages and civilizations, and I should say that everybody refers to me as a historian, but I don't have a single degree in history, although I teach in a history department. So that's another interesting story. But I work in a wide variety of disciplines, and history is perhaps preeminent among them. But I also work in literature and philosophy and cinema studies, um, and so on. So I think that should suffice for the moment.
Yeah, it absolutely does. One of the first things we sort of always like to ask is like, how did you get into your field? How did you get here? So, like, what originally interested you in sort of pursuing this path? And was there any specific like topic that put you on it?
Well, uh, so look, I mean, I'm in my 60s, so I have to go back to to my undergraduate days. I commenced my undergraduate degree in 1978 at Johns Hopkins University. And actually, I'm probably one of the very few academics who doesn't have a degree in any discipline. By which I mean the following: that I didn't have a major for my VA, and I ended up studying history, literature, and philosophy. My bachelor's degree and my master's degree, both conferred in the same year, that is 1982, were awarded by the Humanities Center at Johns Hopkins University. And then I mentioned before that I have a doctorate in South Asian languages and civilizations from the University of Chicago. So, how did I end up where I am? Well, partly it's really by accident, frankly. I have, as I said, for so many years, I've encountered hundreds, thousands of students, and a lot of the history students tell me they have an absolute passion for what they do. Well, I don't know if I really had a passion for any particular discipline, to be quite honest, because when I applied for my doctorate, I recall distinctly to I think 8 universities, and there were 8 different departments. So I applied, for example, to Oriental Studies at Oxford, to South Asian Studies at University of Chicago, to History at UC Berkeley, and so on. And that ended up going to University of Chicago because that's where I had the best offer. So I didn't really go with the intention of studying history per se, and ended up working with a person who I think fairly can be described as one of the two or three most preeminent American scholars who ever worked on Indian history, on modern Indian history, particularly the British period, and that's Bernard Cohn. Was a major figure, and dozens of students, many of whom then went on to occupy places and leading universities, all trained under him. I was among the last students who studied with him. So that I think is roughly the trajectory. But just to give you an illustration that things could have gone in a very different way. I mean, I also studied cinema for a period of time. I had what's called the Thomas Watson Fellowship, and I went to Australia after I finished my BNMA and spent some time in India. And I was really, studying cinema for a year or two, and then finally came back to the U.S. in 1984 to start my doctorate. But now I've been there for 32 years, and as I said, I mean, preeminently now I work really in the domain of what we could call social cultural, intellectual, and political history. I don't work really in economic history or military history, for example, but I do work in wide areas of social, cultural, political, intellectual history, and not just the history of India. At the moment, for example, I'm teaching a course on called Contemporary World History. And contemporary world history, the word contemporary here actually um, means the modern world rather than simply the present moment. And again, when the modern world began is intellectually an interesting question. But the segment I teach begins roughly with the Industrial Revolution and takes us down to the present day. So we're speaking about roughly a 300-year span of time. You know,
Mhm.
so that's kind of a rough overview and some sense of the trajectory that led me to where I am at the moment.
Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting that you highlighted that you focused on so many different spheres of interest because that's something that I think to me really stuck out about your a lot of your discussions on South Asia. You're able to I sort of hate the word discursive for some reason, but that is a very good way to describe it. You'll kind of recognize patterns in films, then jump to textual examples, and it really adds a lot of depth to it. So and I'm sure many other people appreciate that. And to move on to a more specific question about the history of India as a nation state, obviously from a distance, the big major political change has been the emergence of Hindu nationalism. And early on, there's this impression that India was a nominally secular nation state, and people like Jawaharlal Nehru were focused on um, building a secular nation states, which wasn't connected to Hinduism, Islam, and so on. And then, of course, the BJP and a number of other political forces. It kind of, my impression is in the 90s, kind of emerged. And today, of course, the BJP is the largest party, and Hindu nationalism is one of the largest forces in Indian politics. So, how might you kind of trace this? Can you see this? Of course, you can see it in certain groups from the very beginning, but how did this kind of larger scale transition take place on a higher level? Although, of course, it's very difficult to say anything briefly about that.
Yeah. I mean, can I take like 5, 10 minutes on this to answer this, or do you want a much briefer answer?
No, no, feel free to.
10 minutes sounds awesome. Yeah.
Okay, okay. Let me just go. Let me go back to the 1920s. So let's say a century ago, because when we go back to the 1920s, we begin to see the emergence of such organizations as the Hindu Mahasabha. And if you look at contemporary political discourse on Hindu nationalism, you'll see lots of references, both by the advocates of Hindutva and by the opponents of Hindutva. You'll see references to such people as Savarkar, Vinayak Savarkar, and then references to Golwalkar and subsequently Hedgewar. So these people. These three are all three of them are Maharashtrian Brahmins. Let's underscore that fact and just try to keep it in our mind. It is important that they're Maharashtrian Brahmins because, of course, it tells us that they came from their upper caste. And not only are they upper caste, but they come from a certain part of India, that is Maharashtra. What is now called Maharashtra, it wasn't really called Maharashtra. I mean, very broadly, you can think of it as Maratha country if you want, but it was part of the Bombay presidency, as it used to be known in colonial India. Now, why is that important? Just to give you one sense of it, we're not going to do a thorough intellectual history that will take hours. But to give you one instance of it, if you're looking at Hindutva today, you can also think of it as a muscular form of Hindu nationalism, okay? A militant form of Hindu nationalism. Now, the in the late 1920s, these people whom I've referred were advocating precisely for that. There are so many different angles through which one can understand that. So, for example, the whole mythography, I use the word mythography rather than myth. I don't like the word myth for lots of reasons, because that word is a word of abuse now. When people say, "Oh, such and such thing is a myth," but then let us remember that civilizations, including India and Greece, uh, began with, as it were, a huge body of mythic material. One of the things that informs Indian civilization is this massive repository of what we can call mythic material. And myths were crucial in the formation of the Greek imagination. Okay. When we think about what the West has inherited from Greece, people who are learned usually think of Plato and Aristotle, and then they think of the writers of the tragedies, Aeschylus, of Euripides, and so on. But it's the word of Greek myths, which is critically important. So I won't use that word at all. But mythography is a different word. That the word here, which is what is it that happened in the 1920s? A whole elaborate mythography was established about the masculinity and muscular nature of resistance offered by somebody called Shivaji, and then the Marathas. Okay, this became an important part of a developing Indian historiography. This is still very much invoked by the advocates of Hindu nationalism today. So we have to go back to the late 1920s. Now, uh, fast forward a bit, which is that, and here again, there's a very intricate debate which I can't get into it, but I just simply mention it, namely that apart from the development of organizations such as the Hindu Mahasabha, which began to advocate for, let's use that phrase, a Hindu nation state. Okay, so what is it that Savarkar is advocating for in his book on Hindutva, on the essentials of Hindutva? He's talking about India as a Hindu nation state. Okay, it's the land where everyone, even a Muslim, should be aware of that they're living in a land which is essentially the land of Hindus. That is, I'm simplifying the argument, but that's in essence what Savarkar is going to say. And he's also going to uh, write a book, which is really the first works written by an Indian, frankly, on the 1857 rebellion. Okay, what used to be called in the colonial records is Sepoy Mutiny. So it's the 1857-58 rebellion, which is the most determined form of resistance to colonial rule. Eventually, the British did crush it, but it did pose a threat to British rule. And so he writes a book called "The First War of Indian Independence." Right, and the title is very interesting too, there because of course he's also invoking the imagery of the American War of Independence. All right, so Savarkar has laid out the essentials of many of the arguments we're going to encounter today. But as I was about to say, if we fast forward a little bit, there are those historians who have argued that apart from organizations such as the Hindu Mahasabha and another organization called the RSS, which is a Rashtriya Swayam Sevak Sangh, which one of the anodyne translation into English is the National Volunteer Corps. What it is it's a, you know, people used to think of it as a paramilitary organization that did the ideological work of Hindu nationalism. Okay. And it's important to underscore again the fact that there are many people in the current government in the highest positions, at the highest positions, who are lifelong members of the RSS. All right. I want to just mention that. So, apart from these organizations, some historians have argued that the Indian National Congress, which was a secular organization, that this organization itself began to be somewhat communalized, that some there was some infiltration of the Congress by the extreme Hindu elements. All right. And as I said, this is a subject for a very long discussion, so we can't get into that, but it's important to register the fact that certainly, I would say that certainly some left liberal historians would take the view that the Congress wasn't entirely secular, certainly not in the 1930s and moving into the 1940s. And then, of course, in the 1940s, you have, the independence of India, the partition, the emergence of a new nation state. All right. Now, what happens to the RSS? Okay. And these Hindu organizations. Gandhi is assassinated on 30th January 1948. Mohandas Gandhi is assassinated, right? And the assassin, Nathuram Godse, is a member of the RSS. He clearly advocates for the same ideological positions that people like Savarkar had. In fact, Savarkar was, I think it's fair to say, his mentor. Uh, and it's again another long story, but the government of India didn't just put Nathuram Godse on trial. They alleged that there was a whole conspiracy to assassinate Gandhi, and a number of people were convicted. Savarkar was among those who were tried, but he was not convicted. He was not convicted. But a number of other people were convicted, and and a consequence of this assassination was a certain kind of revulsion against these organizations um, uh, came into Indian society. The Indian state, no doubt, headed at this point by Jawaharlal Nehru, who was a prime minister, and the deputy prime minister, who was also the home minister, was uh, uh, Sardar Patel, Vallabhai Patel, who, along with Nehru, had been considered one of Gandhi's right hand men. Okay, uh, th- these two and many others in the Indian government, they felt that the Hindu right wing, that is, these extremist groups, had an assassinating Gandhi, so to speak. Now, when I say in assassinating, of course, a trigger is pulled by Nathuram Godse, but the implication is that there were people who belong to the RSS and the Hindu Mahasabha and other formations who were joyous on hearing this news, and that these people should now have to pay for what had been done. Okay, and in fact, Patel, who was sometimes accused by the liberals of being too soft of these Hindu nationalists, and was sometimes it was they alleged that he was himself actually too much of a Hindu nationalist. Patel said very clearly that these people, the RSS and the Hindu Mahasabha people, they have spread a poison in Indian society. So, what's the implication? The implication is the RSS is going to be banned. The official ban lasts only a year or so. It's not very long, but they are in a way ostracized for a period of time. If I'm to put it this way, they go into the wilderness. They go into the wilderness. Okay. And then 50s and 60s. So let's go back to portions of what the question was. That is it true to say that this period was characterized largely by a kind of a secular disposition? Well, I would say yes. I mean, Arundhati Roy would say no, India was never really secular. But of course, she has, her position on many questions, which is not necessarily the position even of those who are, liberal minded or roughly, adhere to the view that, look, that the period under Nehru, that is from 1947 until his death in May 1964, and for some years after that, that is at least moving into the late 60s, early 1970s, the stamp of secularism remained very strong. I think one way to understand it is this. Let's supposing that one didn't adhere to the view that the Indian state was, you know, uh, always staunchly secularist. Let's take that view for a moment, for argument's sake. I would argue that even if you took that view, it is still correct to say that a secular ethos was part of the upbringing of most people, including myself. I am born in 1961. Okay. So Nehru was alive at that time. When I started going to school, okay, and into my teens, was I aware of the fact that so and so is a Muslim, or that Muslims think very differently than we, quote, Hindus do? Okay. I'm just putting it in a very anecdotal way. Now, what I'm saying is that if you think of it in this way, I think it is correct to say that a certain kind of secular ethos had become part of the fabric of Indian life. I'm speaking here about urban India. Let me also mention that, because in rural India there is no question that a certain kind of secularism had always prevailed. Nobody called it secularism. It wasn't secularism of the modern sort, but it is a demonstrably proven fact. There's insurmountable evidence that communal animosity in India is more an urban problem, far more so an urban problem than a rural problem. Which is not to say that a person in rural India does not think of himself or herself preeminently as a Hindu or a Muslim or a Sikh or whatever they may be. They may think that way, but that didn't preclude them from thinking of people who belong to other religious faiths as part of their same moral universe. Okay. And this is what I meant, that in that rural India, in fact, secularism was far more so a part of the ethos of everyday life. And that is a certain kind of way in which people inhabited the same space. Yes, there were areas of segregation. There always were. I think one should be aware of that. But this was not state mandated segregation either. This is simply the fact that Hindus kept to themselves for in some spheres of life, and Muslims did so, and then there were other spheres of life where they mixed. Okay. So, and then we get to the last stage now, which is the rise of Hindu nationalism. And that is, of course, a very long story. I've given you the roots of it now, going back to the 1920s. But part of the problem that we have to think about is we have to think about this disease. And what is a disease? It's called the nation state. The nation state is a diseased entity no matter where it is in the world. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is you cannot have a nation state without a violence. No nation state became a nation state without perpetrating violence. And who does it perpetrate violence upon? It perpetrates violence upon all those who are the other in various ways. You know, you just look at just look at how the United States became a nation state. You look at how France became a nation state, how Germany became a nation state. Okay. And we can see that act that forms of violence are endemic to the making of a nation state. This means what? Now let's take follow the implications of that. That a nation state always tends towards homogeneity. Right? And this was the fundamental attempt, frankly, beginning in the 1980s, especially, to attempt to render India into an increasingly more homogeneous nation state. And that meant not the elimination of people, but what it meant was that everybody had to be cajoled, had to be coerced into thinking in a certain way. Right? And this is where the agenda of Hindu nationalism starts to become singularly important. Okay? Because, of course, India is, let's take the 1980s. You have the second most populous country in the world, right? It's only become the most populous country in the world as of last year. The second most populous country in the world. Who ever paid any attention to India? No one did. There was a huge amount of anxiety in India that we're such a large country and we have virtually no presence anywhere on the international scene. The only time, and I can tell you that, I'm doing my PhD in University of Chicago in the 1980s, and then in the 1990s, I I joined UCLA as a professor. When do I see India mentioned in the newspapers? When I see India mentioned in the newspapers in a very big way when the Bhopal gas leak takes place, when Mrs. Gandhi is assassinated, right? It's incidents like that. It's one calamity after another, and that's when India comes into the consciousness. Otherwise, everybody's largely indifferent. Now, the elites in India began to think that we need to really make our presence felt. And this also is part of the story of the rise of Hindu nationalism, which almost no one tells. Because the only story they're telling is how, Hindu ideologues became important. Uh, and then, of course, you have to have a general idea of how religion starts to become important, not simply in India, but in many other countries in the world, including, of course, Pakistan, right? So this is really the broader picture of how we came to where we are today.
Yeah, thank you. It's a very that was a really great explanation. I'm glad you gave us the longer of two answers. To go more specifically into what you said about the elites in India during that time, feeling that we should kind of, and anyone who's paid attention to Indian politics, I don't think is any stranger to this idea that we're going to be a superpower and we're kind of competing with China and all of this kind of rhetoric. Was there anything economically that occurred? Was it perhaps the disillusion of the Nehruvian
Yeah.
kind of not aligned economy, so to speak? Was there anything that could be used to ground it in a historical materialist analysis?
Yes, yes, of course. I mean that's often mentioned, right? I mean it's the neoliberalization, reforms. Okay, so I mean, let's just take the year 1990 just as a benchmark. Okay, and you can also take 1950 as a benchmark. If you take 1950, what's the importance of 1950? Not the year itself, just taking that year 1950 51. It doesn't matter. India and China were exactly on par. Exactly. Right? If you're looking at GDP, or their share of the contribution to the world economy, which was insignificant. Insignificant, right? 1990, China has already gone considerably ahead of India. The reforms, as they're called, in you know, uh, began in China circa 1980. In India, it is Manmohan Singh, Narasimha Rao. Those are the two people who are often credited with having jump-started the Indian economy. There are some dissenting views, by the way, on whether India's uh, uh, rate of growth is going to jump as much as some of the statistics suggest. There are statistics and there are statistics. There are all kinds of ways to interpret statistics. But so to go directly to your question, the Nehruvian dream had soured. Why? Because the pie never grew. It wasn't simply a matter of who gets what share of the pie. The pie never grew, right? That is the standard view of those who defend neoliberalization and the economic reforms which started in 1990, right? And it is certainly the case that there was a phrase that was used to describe the rate of growth uh, 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 in Nehruvian India. It was called the Hindu rate of growth, you know, right? That basically actually the economic growth rate was basically the growth rate of uh, the Hindu population. If so, it was all done very mockingly that things are it's all increasing very, very slowly, very incrementally, and uh, no one is really uh, being able to claim that India has made giant economic strides. Okay, so I think your question is invoking all of that. Now, of course, the question is, because I think implicit to your in your question, even though you didn't put it that way, is there two things? One, is there a relationship between the rise of Hindu nationalism, okay, and what we might describe as those reforms? I think that's implicit in your question. And the second thing that's implicit in it is how do we view that today from the vantage point of today, going back to 1990 and then that decade of economic reforms? And the answer to both those questions, if I'm correct in reading your question, is very simply that yes, there is a relationship between the rise of Hindu nationalism and what we might describe as economic nationalism. Okay. That is that the same Hindu, the people who advocate for a muscular Hindu nation state and all of that, and the person who's presiding over that, the person presiding over that is the prime minister. And what does the prime minister do? What model did he put to the nation? He said the Gujarat model, right? Because Gujarat was put forward as a model state which had shown accelerated development. Accelerated development. Well, I was in Gujarat, by the way, earlier this year. I wouldn't say that I necessarily agree with that characterization of accelerated development. I see lots of wasted development, and I see huge swaths of areas which are absolute wasteland. But we won't get moved in that direction necessarily. The important point was this also that uh, this model of nationalism was also predicated, both Hindu nationalism and economic nationalism, predicated on the idea that we don't have to worry about such things as is individual liberties. Okay, this is a luxury because in that sense, the model that India is really looking to, that the elites are looking to, is not the U.S. Okay, or the advanced economies of the West. They're looking at countries such as Singapore. Why Singapore? Because it's an illustration of a country that has almost no natural resources of its own, and yet has a very high standard of living, uh, completely modern nation state, and completely authoritarian. Completely authoritarian. So there was always this feeling that Prime Minister Modi and the BJP party and the RSS people were able to bank upon. What is that feeling? They understood that Indians may not always say it clearly, but the Indian middle class had a hankering for this kind of authoritarianism, which meant that, look, let's not worry about, individual liberties, freedom of speech, freedom of expression. All of that is nonsense. It's a luxury. First, let's just accelerate our economic development. And you can see how this model is being put to use in India today. Unfortunately, there's very little to show in terms of real economic development, if you ask me. Yes, there's some infrastructural developments, I agree. Okay. But I just came back a month ago. And I mean, I'm looking at Gurgaon and I'm driving down large uh, number of roads at Gurgaon, which is this huge satellite city, right? That is glittery and everything. And entire avenues, 2 kilometers long, that are just garbage dumps and nothing else. Just a few kilometers from where you have the shiny buildings. You know, so this idea that that uh, uh, these neo liberal reforms have helped to produce a real modern nation state, and that is with respect to development and all of that. This is to a considerable degree
Uh,
illusory.
Professor Lal, sorry for cutting you off at the end there, but one thing I've always found interesting is that Hindutva really focuses itself on sort of like a mythology around the or really narratives, I should say, around the Mughal Empire, right? Like they don't only look back at the British Raj, they also look back at the Mughal Empire and sort of view it as a point where like it led to India in its current situation and we sort of have to correct it. How do you see this understanding of history shaping, modern day Indian politics? I'm so sorry for asking you such a broad question, but I just needed to know.
No, no, it's not a broad question at all. I mean, it goes to the heart of many of the things that I've written about in recently, and I mean, in some cases, going back to 25 years, I did a book called The History of History, Politics and Scholarship in Modern India, published by Oxford University Press in 2002. The question you're asking is a question I take up in that book. So it's only now it's only the people of the present generation who think that the question of the Mughals and what role they played in Indian history is really coming up for no the Hindu right has been animated by this question for a very long period of time. Believe me, okay, and in fact, and it's not an accident that people like Savarkar were working primarily. Apart from being an ideologue, he was working primarily in the mode of a historian. So, to answer your question, we have to go to the question of history, okay? In the broadest sense, in a theoretical sense. You see, uh, this idea that you can capture the past through something called history is an idea we have to be extremely wary of. And I'm saying that as someone who's teaching in a history department. Okay. So
Right.
you can imagine what some of my colleagues think of some of the things I say, because this is bread and butter for them. But you have to make a distinction between history and the past. The two are not the same. The question is, how do we access the past? Unfortunately, history has become the only way of accessing that past. In this way, India is fully emulating the West. Of
Mm.
course, there were traditions of historiography in India, but let it be noted very carefully, and this is an argument I've made very consistently, and I will not back down from that argument because I'm fully aware of how the past has been accessed in India and who did work of history and so on. The Muslim rulers had an interest in history, and the first historical works, practically speaking, in India come to us with the coming of Islam, fundamentally. No, anyone who thinks that the Mahabharata or a Ramayana is a work of history has no understanding of those works whatsoever. Which is not to say that you cannot read those works to try to gain some insight into how people were thinking at that time. Whenever those works were composed, and they weren't composed in a short period of time. The Mahabharata is composed over a period of 800 years. Okay, from roughly 400 BCE to 400 of the Common Era, 400 CE. History, okay, now then is a certain kind of discipline. Okay, and this discipline is a discipline that begins to be embraced in a very vigorous way by Indian nationalists in the 19th century, because what they understood is what nationalists have understood everywhere, that if we don't write our past, somebody else will do it for us, which is what the English were doing. At the Indian view, of course, was that particularly as Indians became more astute about what the British were writing about India, that they're really misrepresenting our past, right? They're misrepresenting our history in particular. And so the writing of history starts to become critically important beginning in the late 19th century. And today it is the master discipline for all the Hindu nationalists. If there's one thing they want to do, ideologically speaking, what they want to do is they want to change the way in which we think about Indian history, about the Indian past, and how we interpret it. And that's one reason why they have been greatly animated by the Mughals, because the supposition on their part is that there's a kind of a consensus. The Hindu national view says that nationalist view says there's a kind of a consensus in the world, to the extent that people know anything about this, obviously, that the greatest period of the last several hundred years was the Mughal period. And who is a Mughal emperor who's always invoked as the preeminent example, let's say, of tolerance, right? I think you know the answer, right? Akbar. Okay.
Mm.
And then of course, if you look, for example, and here again, we will not get into the specifics of whether all economic historians agree with this finding or not. But there's a Cambridge economist. His name is Angus Madison, and 2 decades ago, he came up with this data, which was just absolutely astounding to lots of people. I think today is part of the common sense of what people understand what happened at that time, frankly. And what was the data he came up with? That if you look at let's say India, circa the world, if you look at the world circa 1700 to 1800, what are the three largest economies of the world at that time? China, India, and Europe put together. At the three, be- among the three of them, you have accounted for virtually 95% of the world's GDP. And that India accounted for 25% of the world's GDP moving into the 1700s. Right? Now, the point is this, that you might think to yourself that the present government should take the view that, look, eh, w- the real the real guilt here uh, should be associated with the British. Because what is it that happened to India under colonial rule? That India became a land of deep and depressing immiseration, i.e., poverty. A country that was accounted for 25% of the world's GDP at the height of the Mughal Empire, even under Aurangzeb, okay, in the 1700s. Akbar is, of course, earlier, right? In the 1700s, Aurangzeb dies in 1707, but so we're talking about the late 1600s and then moving into the 1700s, into the period of his successors before the disintegration of the Mughal Empire begins and the British begin to establish their presence. This was a commanding world economy. And not only a commanding world economy, the Mughal Empire was an extraordinarily important player on the what we can retrospectively call the global intellectual cultural scene. Nobody thought of it that way, okay, in the way in which we think of world culture today. All right. But I'm saying that it was an extraordinarily important player in many ways. Now, under the British, India becomes severely deindustrialized. And I tell you that the period 1875 to 1925 is a period of such catastrophic death that I think almost all Indians, barring those who have really read deeply into that period, have no awareness of what happened. And that in those 50 years, there were an 100 million excess deaths. 100 million. And you can track it, by the way, from census data, among other things. And what's causing these 100 million excess deaths? Okay. Plagues, epidemics, cholera, measles, hunger, famine. And who's responsible for a large portion of that, including famine? British policies in India, right? So this entire emphasis on the Mughals that you're now finding, where the Mughals are being sort of being, you know, beaten into submission retrospectively, as it were. Okay, where the Mughals are being branded as a real enemy, taking Aurangzeb, who is viewed as someone who had huge animus against the Hindus and the Sikhs. This is, in fact, such an extraordinary distortion. Okay, that is taking the whole Mughal period. It's a distortion that fully serves the purpose of Hindu nationalists, because there is no question in my mind that Hindu nationalism has a fundamental problem with the Muslim presence in India. I think we need to state it as bluntly as that. All right. And that is really, I mean, we can discuss many other aspects of the history of the Mughals. And again, I want to be very clear. I want to be very clear uh, that when you're looking at somebody like Aurangzeb, I'm not putting him forward as an example of tolerance necessarily, but there's very deep scholarly work done to look at his period, the period that he was presiding over, which is a period that extends to well over 40 years as emperor. Okay, uh, his reign is as long as the reign of Akbar. Um, if you look at that period, there is no question that there were some policies that were pursued, which were certainly detrimental to the Hindu population and to the Sikh population, the imposition of jizya, which is a poll tax, okay, a head tax, which was to which non-Muslims were subjected. But you should note, by the way, that there are lots of exceptions that are also carved out in the jizya. So women who are pregnant, elderly people, for example, people who are blind, people who are disabled, none of them, even if they're not Muslims, don't have to pay. None of them have to pay the jizya. I mean, so we can get into the particulars of what really happened even under Aurangzeb, but in any case, the question is Aurangzeb is only one of many Mughal emperors, right? You have to take the period in totality. It's a period which is enormously rich in many respects. That's, if you had to come to a brief conclusion, that's a conclusion you'd come to after a study of that period, right? So I think we have to understand what is it that, what is the animus that drives Hindu nationalism, okay? And that will tell us a lot about how they reconstruct the past, how they deploy history, okay, how they instrumentalize it, right? And and here again, let me also add this caveat. If you read my history of history, I'm very clear in that book, in my book, that this is not the first time when I was writing it. So this is long before Mr. Modi and the present government came into power. Okay, the book was published in 2002, the history of history. But these disputes, which you see as disputes over the content of history textbooks. So both of you may be aware that over the course of the last 2 3 years, there's been a serious attempt to tamper with the content of history textbooks, school textbooks. But as I make it very clear, this has a very long history. There were Congress governments that were involved in this too. It should be noted very clearly. Okay. But certainly not on the scale on which they have been doing that, okay, in India since 2014. And I think one analogy you can think of is what's happening in modern day Trump's America, okay, where there is a complete evisceration, okay, of certain kinds of histories taking place. Over 1,000 books have been removed from libraries, for example. What we're talking about in the U.S. today is the sort of thing that the Indian government has been doing in different ways, particularly since 2014.